Hello, everybody, and welcome to our world today, the Unionist perspective. Today, we're looking into a few topics that we believe are quite worthy of exploration in terms of what's happening around us. And we hope to provide some insights and share some healing with you as we speak through these topics. So also we'd like to invite you to please feel free to share your insights with us in the comments section, and we would be really happy to engage with you. So I'm going to hand over to the team. I believe that our most primary topic is the version of the US government shutdown. So yeah, I'd like to hand over to the team unless there's any other topic that anybody believes is more topical at this point in time.
Yeah, I guess we could start things up with the aversion of the shutdown, to use a pun. I feel like that was a good pun. But yeah, so basically with that, like the whole issue was that the US government, as we mentioned last week, the US government was going to shut down, meaning like it wouldn't have funding. So there were going to be essential workers who do things funded by the government that would have to just keep going, doing their work without getting paid for some time, like however long the shutdown lasted. There would be some stuff would just shut down in that case. But that was averted on Saturday when there was an agreement reached, basically. And the Speaker of the House had to do with that because Kevin McCarthy, the House is controlled by, well, it's majority Republican and stuff. But so they were going to like not pass anything, right? Like it was this whole standoff about funding and regarding like border security with the Mexico border, and also funding for the war in Ukraine and other things too. But those were the two main things, and they were huge points of contention. The more far right portions of the Republican Party wanted the funding for the border security, and they wanted less funding for Ukraine. And they did agree on a short-term spending bill that doesn't give anything to Ukraine, but it's just short-term, so there'll be time to like reconsider. But yeah, basically part of this deal was, so they were like, if we're going to avert the government shutdown and create a temporary bill, we have to change the House rules to say that anybody can bring forward a challenge to a vote to remove the Speaker of the House, basically, because what they wanted to do was like the farther right elements in the Republican Party wanted to be like, okay, so if you're going to compromise with the other side, then we're going to try to remove you as a Speaker of the House. So if you want to avert the shutdown, you have to allow that. And so that was allowed. And so yes, now Matt Gaetz, the representative from Florida, put forth a motion to like vote to recall the Speaker of the House, basically. So in the media, sometimes they just focused on this drama of like Matt Gaetz versus Kevin McCarthy. And I feel like that's unnecessary, but it raises good questions about like what to do in a leadership situation and what politics are at play here, or is this just a case of like principles over politics, like being like, we've got to agree on something to keep our government funded, and the consequences are less important than that. So yeah, that's my summary of it. Would you guys like to add anything or say anything?
So yeah, I think one of the things that I would like to take a step back on is the conditions under which the speaker could be recalled. And as far as I remember, there was a conversation around 15 rounds of voting, in which those rounds of voting at various stages had these concessionary requirements tabled. One of those being that a vote to recall the speaker can be proposed by a single individual as opposed to 3 to 5 people. And my understanding was that at the time, the recall vote or the recall proposal has always been something that one person could table. And McCarthy actually tried to increase it so that there had to be a bit of a caucus in tabling a proposal to recall. And through the rounds of voting in his process to become the speaker, that was one of the concessions that was then given in ensuring that he gets that speaker seat. But having said that, there seems to have always been this kind of animosity between him and Gates in terms of his nomination and subsequent election to that speaker seat. So I think part of it has always been this level of animosity and literally just looking for a reason to oust the man. But then when you consider that a national shutdown literally has implications for the entire country, and that he tabled a bill that was majority supported by the Democrats as opposed to the Republicans, you have to understand the significant impact of his action and potentially the significant risk that he took on himself in a leadership position to get something passed, regardless of whether it's a stopgap or not. It literally averted the shutdown to allow for more time for the conversations to happen and for the budgets to be agreed so that they can be signed into law. So the big thing that stood out for me is this almost macho measuring contest between McCarthy and Gates, if it plays out, is going to ensure that the time becomes shorter and shorter, because obviously the Republicans have to decide how they are going to vote and how many of them want to get support from each other in one way or another. And then, of course, the Democrats have to decide how they're going to vote and whether to support him. And part of the analysis was that in order for him to keep his seat, it's likely that he's going to need to be bailed out by the Democrats as opposed to the Republicans. So it's sowing a lot of discord within the House of, I think it's House of Representatives. And so, yeah, I just feel like there's a lot at play, but it literally feels to me like a chess game. So who has the most powerful piece on the board and how much influence can they garner in their bid to either oust him or to reaffirm him?
Yeah, well, I agree on the chess game type of thing. I think it's also important to take a step back and understand that as a spiritual being, he did what was important for his country, but energetically, he made the choice to still respect the people. respect the people and their vote. And if he hadn't done that, he wouldn't be, I guess, making a precedent for everyone else. He would be allowing people to prioritize their position of power over service and serving the people. And I think, yeah, it's dramatic and it's going to change probably the nature of his seat, and he might be revoked from being a spokesperson, things like that. But like, I feel like the truth at the core is that whatever it is, like, he chose service, and it was really like a divine choice. And I feel it might be important to say like, hey, there's this, and we're in the middle of politics. And we understood this last week when we said that basically the government was going to shut down because this was something about like being on a political spectrum and not agreeing because you're on a political spectrum. And now we understand it's not because what they believe as in terms of like being on the right side of the spectrum, on the left side of the spectrum. It's more about their position inside like the House or the Senate. And that's understandable. But now that McCarthy has made the right choice, I think it's important to say like, hey, let go of this. And he's setting things right just by saying, at the end of the day, what's most important is serving people, not your seat, not the immigration bill, not the drama. And yes, there will be drama afterwards, but the choice remains. And I think that's what we probably should talk about. By the way, I'm curious to know what exactly is a stopgap funding bill, because I'm not sure any of the press explains it, either because they're too focused on the drama, or because they feel like it's mostly like Americans reading and they probably know what it is. So I'm not sure, like, can someone explain a little bit?
So my understanding is literally it's a bailout. It's literally, one of those last minute agreements that stops the ship from going down. So I don't think there's a specific technical explanation to it other than we had to sign something to avert the crisis, and this is what we did, and that's called a stopgap measure.
Okay, just to be sure.
Yeah.
So that was like easy as a choice. Like, I think that's a super important lesson. Like, let things be easy, don't let them be filled with like ego crap and layers of heaviness. And I think it's important for the administration to lighten the load on themselves, because oftentimes by portraying power, like we get deep into things that don't help the majority of the people.
So partly, I also think that we need to be cognizant of the fact that he did this actually at personal risk, at great personal risk. And so on a level, you might almost consider it self-sacrificing. And we have to then understand if that self-sacrifice will benefit him because he gains greater support. I mean, and something that stood out to me was some of the Democratic Party, some were saying, yes, we'll definitely vote to oust him. And then you have a comment, a quoted comment. So I'm not certain if it's this way it is in true form, but quoted comment from Biden saying, well, maybe he now sees what the party that he is representing actually stands for. So, those kind of things seem to fuel the controversy, but you also have to consider that there's value in the statement, even if it isn't his direct statement. And it literally begs the question, what do you stand for? And does your party stand for the same thing? And do you choose to continue to stand with them or not?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because a government shutdown could be like seen as popular, I guess, for some of these politicians, like Matt Gaetz, for example. Like maybe I feel so with these kind of tactics, I feel like it's really unlikely that anybody would propose doing it unless they thought that the people who voted for them or the people who will vote for them would like it, right? And so apparently some of the constituents of some of the politicians there, in the Republican Party, would like that. And they're like, we want you to use literally any means necessary to possibly push this legislation forward. And it doesn't matter. The consequences don't matter. And if there's a government shutdown for some time, we will just, I don't know, we'll just deal with it. And then eventually it will be over and we'll get what we want, And I think that's the thought behind it. And it's just, I don't know, you could say, I mean, technically, like, it's their job to represent their constituents, but I feel like spiritually, that's not really the truth here, in that just because something would be popular with your constituents, it doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do. And I don't know, that's how I feel about it. And I feel like this feels basically like the decision that happened. It feels like a check on that kind of thinking of being like, we are just going to go for whatever policies we want that aren't even life or death, decisions. Like, these aren't life or death decisions. These are like important, but it's not like, imminent. It's not like an imminent issue or anything like that. None of this stuff is like that kind of thing. This is saying like, we're not going to have those kind of tactics, and we're going to try to get around that. And no matter if it might be unpopular with some people. And I know, I feel like that's a good thing. Whether the Democrats will reward McCarthy or not for doing that, and will be like seeing him as like someone who they can work with, isn't really certain. Because so this is the other side of the coin, right, of partisanship. Because usually when people talk about partisanship, they're talking about people of the other party, right, or another party in the US. And they're like, oh my gosh, like those Republicans are so partisan. That's so irrational of them. But then if the Democrats are the same way, they're like, no, because it's for a good cause, right? No, we're right. It doesn't matter. So part of me is wondering, so some of the Democratic politicians, they might see it as really popular for them to oust Kevin McCarthy, because they're like, oh my gosh, taking down like this Republican Speaker of the House, our constituents are going to love that, because we lost the House to the Republicans. They put in their speaker. Whoever the speaker happens to be, taking him down is a big win for us, right? In the eyes of our voters. I don't know if that's like a divine thing. Like, why would you take down Kevin McCarthy? Like, just because you just want to you just want to score points? Or would there be more to that? Or would it just be partisanship again, but just from the Democratic side? Do you know what I mean? I just wanted to throw that out there so we can get all views, all angles on this. Yeah.
I don't even, I don't even think, I don't even know if it's like important or not to discuss it, but I feel like there's something there. And I feel like the reason why McCarthy feels like a better national choice, like is a most famous, more famous politician and Gates, if we can say so, in terms of the public eye, is like his stability. And I think he's proven his stability now. And I think like a lot of constituents actually care about like having stable laws and bills passed. And that's what he represents. I don't think those constituents are like, let's just do whatever we want with our laws and country and constitution. I think that's very much a political, dramatic thing, even when you're Republican. So it sheds lights on the fact that a lot of people are actually about like, hey, let's chill out and do what's best for our country, whatever that means for them. And I think on the other side, in the Democrats, I think it's really indicative of like the choices of a country. And I think there's probably going to be a choice in national terms. I mean, so probably the presidentials, about someone that can respect that stability and respect the public opinion on whatever side of the spectrum they're on. And I think that's in this that today's discussion is important. Not the drama of partisanship, but who will actually take this and say like, okay, like we can work together, or like even when we don't like each other, what's best for the country. And so it would be easy to say like, oh my God, Democrats and Republicans are just going to like hit each other again and again. It's never going to end, and they're going to bash McCarthy. But it doesn't even really matter. What matters is like the small small and big voices that are going to say, hey, in that, like I choose to be stable and I choose to see what matters, which is serving the country. And hopefully, like if we analyze like how every election is, except for that of Trump, where it was a great upheaval, there are a lot of drama, people are in the research of like stability more and more, because that's that's what is like the priority right now after COVID. And there's probably going to be, I would say like McCarthy was already famous, so it might put him in a good position, but it might also put all the people that respect the situation and manage this situation best in a good position as well. So I think that's in this that it's important, not in who will get into the drama the most and how ridiculous it is, because it will be ridiculous. But like who will also actually make divine choices, because I agree, like a lot of people will probably take the situation and not do things that are very divine. So yeah. So it's all about choices.
So I agree with you that it's definitely it's a lot about choices, but I also agree with Sage in the sense that there's going to definitely be and it's probably going to require people to pay more attention. And literally, that's exactly what COVID did at the time. We may not have liked how it played out, but it required it. We learned to pay attention to what was happening around us. And so when we now look at a process that stopped the shutdown. It's going to require people to pay attention. It's probably going to highlight to voters to pay attention to people that are working in their best interests. So there's a lot of self-serving behavior that's starting to actually surface so that people pay attention to it prior to the elections. And we mustn't lose sight of that. We must also not lose sight of the fact that there's a significant power play, and it will need to be a significant power play prior to the presidential election. It has to play out in this way. The other thing is, how well are these guys serving their purpose in highlighting the contrast so that people make healthier and better, more comprehensive choices? So we need to just consider that while it appears dramatic on the surface, they are serving a purpose. And if you look at what is happening, they're serving their purpose really well. And the fact is, you have to highlight controversy in order for somebody to consider making a new choice. And we have spoken about it a couple of times over various conversations, that there is a desperate need for stability worldwide. And this is once again just bringing that to the forefront. I mean, how much more can you highlight something than to say, these people have played a part in such a way that we almost shut down the government? Like, how much more of a warning bell do you need to say, pay attention, make the right choices when you're voting for your leaders?
Very true. And I guess you mentioned something about like, what are your choices and are they in alignment with your party? And I definitely feel like it also relates to leadership everywhere, even in religious groups. And that's the tone of our next story, which is like pretty short, pretty simple, like in Punjab, very west region of India, very village-like, very rural and poor. There was the first LGBT marriage celebrated in a Sikh temple, and that was huge. And although like the reporter was clearly siding with like the LGBTQ couple overly and with a little bit of drama to it, I think it highlighted very well that consciousness is changing, because like both families, very traditional, gave their blessing to the wedding, and the only ones that weren't really happy were the leaders of the Sikh religion, who suspended the guy that did the ceremony at the time. And yeah, I just want to talk about it, maybe short, but it's definitely something about choice as well, about what you represent. And I want you guys to tell me your thoughts on it.
You said the priest that did the ceremony was suspended?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, because I was going to say something funny about that. He said that he didn't know that that the women, both the women, one of them identify as man, and he said that I had no idea that there were two women that I was performing a ceremony for, and I just thought that was really funny. But yeah, this story really shows that love wins. Like it, I'm sure it was hard for them, like both families. But at the end, both the families accepted that they love each other, and regardless of their gender, they wanted to marry each other, which is so profound in such a small area and village where, you know, LGBTQ rights have not been widespread. So it really shows how big of an impact you can make when you just keep going forward in your heart and following your heart. So it was a very nice story to hear.
So I think something that stood out for me quite a bit was that India had only decriminalized same-sex relationships in 2018. So by timeline standards, quite a new acceptance in the country. And then, you know, the priest saying, well, hey, I didn't realize. I mean, you know, literally there's a legal concept that says if your defense is fanciful, then it can't be true. And the fact of the matter is, when these two people who are getting married provide proof of the identification, it is incumbent on the priest to actually read the document. And, you know, at some point in my career, we literally got to the point where we would tell people to read the fucking thing, just because they never do. So people will ask you questions because they haven't read something, or they'll ask you questions because they're too lazy to read something. And so when somebody's defense under these circumstances is fanciful, you kind of have to go, okay, you're just trying to literally cover your ass right now. But having said that, I do believe, and I agree with you, Nadia, that it is definitely a good news story, regardless of what the circumstances are, because what it's showing is that actually love does win. And yes, it might take time, and they might have to do various things to get to the point where it becomes law that their same-sex marriage is recognized. But love does win. And we also know from the story that there's currently legal proceedings and representation around same-sex marriage and legalizing it. So I think it, you know, it just highlights it. It just brings it into focus. It makes it top of mind that confusion, while it may have reigned supreme, is serving a purpose.
Don't you think that he could potentially, like, because it was clearly said in the article that the response from the Sikh Indian leader was that identification was clearly about two women at birth, even if one had changed pronouns and was presenting as a man. Don't you think that the priest was just protecting them and lying? There's a possibility that it was definitely lying. And then it would like be a really beautiful parallel to, am I going to respect the divine choices, or am I going to respect the dogma? And it kind of brings a parallel to McCarthy as well. And it's like, okay, like my dogma is saying this, but I'm choosing what feels good. And it cost him his position as a priest in some ways, but it feels like there's such a peace in the way he responded to his leader. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm not convinced. I definitely don't believe that he didn't know. If anything, he knew and chose to ignore the law anyway. And I feel like he's covering himself up. He's just making sure that he secures his position in one way or another. And the fact of the matter is, claiming ignorance doesn't excuse you from the fact that you chose to do something. And people tend to choose to claim ignorance when they do not have the courage of their convictions?
I guess so. I mean, maybe it feels like, well, I don't know. Maybe, yeah, this guy was like, yeah, like I don't, like I support love, and so I support you guys, and I'm gonna do the marriage ceremony. And then when the consequences actually came, you know, from the Sikh religious leadership, whatever, he was like, oh, you know, this is kind of scary. It feels scary to me, and so I'm gonna say something to try to avert it or something. It could be that, but it could be what Yureen said too. And honestly, as coming from like the perspective of a trans person, although I don't know if he identifies as trans, the guy in the couple, but he does go by male pronouns. I felt it was like kind of affirming as well, that he was like, oh, I didn't know that it was a marriage between like quote unquote two women. I thought it was a marriage between a man and a woman, because, you know, the guy in the couple just feels very like comfortable and at peace and like very grounded in claiming his masculine identity, you know, so it feels very natural. It feels very natural. And the only thing that made it like the societal judgment is kind of like surrounding it and everything, and there's that element. But I feel like within the union, I don't know, because we don't know if they're twin flames, but within the, I guess, marriage of these two people, it feels like there's just a lot of peace and security and stability in following love and in the acceptance that they have for themselves and each other. And what my feeling about that in this story is, that's kind of this beautiful little untouchable bubble of love amid like these stormy seas of, you know, prejudice. And I feel like that's what needs to be highlighted the most. But yeah, so I agree. And I'm also, maybe the priest didn't see any legal documents. It makes me wonder that if these people just came up to him and were like, can we get married? And the priest was like, sure. And, you know, the priest totally thinks that that's a man and a woman, which it is in spiritual truth, probably. But you know what I mean? Like, yeah. So anyway, those are my feelings and thoughts.
Yeah, I just love it. I feel like this is beautiful. Sorry, there's an announcement going on.
Yeah, I agree. It is highlighting a pattern about like what is important to actually highlight in the story as well. As you said it, I think it's a lesson for us as well in progressing through the media and the information that we have, and sifting through the drama and going to the truth of the story. And I think a lot of the topics that we're discussing at the moment are that. And the next one was probably that too, because it's really multi-layered. We love those multi-layered ones here. But it's about like Russia recruiting Cuban mercenaries. And I think it speaks of relationship with Cuba and Russia. I think it also speaks to not really Russia at large and the choices of Russia, because we know the choices of Russia. We know they would do anything to just have what they want. And they're in need of soldiers, because they have a internal crisis in terms of soldiers. So mercenaries are the next best thing. And a lot of our mercenaries were lost to the old Moscow. There is also this other part where it was interesting to read the article where it was really like following Cubans, because it's their story as well. And highlighting what we've been getting at for the past few months. And it's that, I guess, amidst like the good things that, positive things that Cuba has, like about the health system and things like that, people are actually very much struggling to even get like bread and milk on a day-to-day basis. And so they're locked into this situation by the government, and so not free. And so from a not free situation, they're going into another not free situation, but where the salary is better, just so they can leave, and that is being a mercenary. So I think like amidst everything, the core of the story, the core of the story would be, what is it like for Cubans? You know, so that's the open question.
Okay, the announcement's done. Just real quick, just to
Yeah.
finish that, and then we'll move on. I just wanted to say, yeah, I think it's a beautiful story. I think it shows the evolution of consciousness in this space, like to see that happening in India, in a place like that. And they might be twin flames. That's all I want to say. But we can move on now.
So Irene, I think when we start to delve into the Russian-Cuban story, you know, one of the things that kind of stood out for me is something that we spoke about a few months ago, in that there was a challenge with Russians enlisting in the army, and there was this forced enlistment. But I do agree with you that we tend to see mercenaries as the bad guy, but we don't always understand what fuels the behavior of choosing to participate in conflict in another place. And when we listen to some of the account of what the Cuban mercenaries are saying in this article, they're saying, I'm moving so that I can have a life, so that I can make money to support my family, so that there's something to improve. So, you know, unfortunately, there's always the caveat of from great adversity comes necessity. And in that necessity, you might participate in things that you wouldn't naturally or normally participate in. So there's always intention and motive that underlies the behavior of people under many circumstances. I think it's something that we do need to be cognizant of in terms of understanding the core of the story, because there's always motive. We know, for instance, motive in terms of this Russian-Ukraine invasion is literally to re-establish a sovereignty of a USSR that no longer exists. But at the same time, we also have to understand that where you're starting to now look for mercenaries to enlist in your army, you can just start to also feel a sentiment of a lack of support nationally from the citizens of a country that requires you to resort to other extremes. So there's a lot at play in terms of starting to make us just realize that there's much more significant cracks in the support of the Russian people supporting this war effort than what is being publicized. And that starts to tell you that the foundation of this war that we knew was shaky is continuing to be shaky, and may even be more shaky than what we thought it was.
I think
Yeah.
there was an account at the very, very, very beginning of the Russian-Ukraine conflict about like people that are researchers in geopolitics say that you can do anything and Russians will not budge or do anything to go against your government, but you touch families, and that's where the trauma of many, many wars and like build a knife again and again and again, several times in decades have been, and you start to have resistance. And so the fact that so many people were killed in this war in Ukraine is starting to be like we don't have enough soldiers and people don't want to go there and we don't have the approval of people to go there. And that's simply the reality of it, is that Russians are hurt in this place. And so even though their choice is not clear, they're not going to get, the government is not going to get any support on that front. So yeah, I don't know. What do you want to add to that, Sage?
That, yeah, I was in reading and watching videos about this. It seems like this is like Russia is kind of the Russian government or whoever is, well, never mind. Whoever, I was gonna say whoever's involved in this like human trafficking or recruiting of Cubans. But I wouldn't use the terms whoever is involved because it's most definitely like the Russian government, you know, doing it, because it'd be hard to imagine that it weren't. But I feel like they're kind of like just taking advantage of Cuba or of the situation the Cuban citizens are in, basically, because like the reduction of tourism, like since the pandemic, and a lot of government mismanagement, including the government suddenly decided to devalue, I think it was devalue their currency to make some sort of economic adjustment. To me, that makes it sound like they're trying to make exports seem more attractive by devaluing Cuban currency. So then the exports would like become quote unquote cheaper, but I don't know why they did that. But anyway, these things are having like really, really bad effects on the Cuban economy. And people have been like in line, like for gas and for food items and everything, you know? And so, and yeah, prices going up on a lot of goods in Cuba. So I feel like Russia would just step in and be like, since our countries have been getting closer, because we're both like internationally really isolated and we have a history and everything together, we're just going to come in and just, you know, offer these like opportunities maybe in quotes, to these Cubans. And I guess some of them didn't know what it was that they were getting into, but it just seemed better than their situation in Cuba. And so I feel like it's that. And I know, I feel like it just shows that, yeah, like, you know, you can't really win by a partnership with Russia. And even though like Cuba might feel like they have few allies, like, for example, the countries that supply Cuba with like gasoline aren't sending them enough because they're having issues at home, like Venezuela, for example. Cuba's like, we have so few friends, like, you know, there might be the feeling among Cubans, like, I got an opportunity from Russia, like, let's go for it. There are many opportunities, but it's like, it's not really good. It's kind of like the poisoned honey, and it's just like Germany and the rest of Europe relying on Russia for energy resources. And it's like, it may seem nice because it's cheap and it's nearby, but it's not a good deal, you know, in the end.
So one of my concerns around all of these things, and I think, Sage, you kind of started to allude to it, is the significant destabilization of the global economy. Because we're seeing a lot of currencies being devalued. We're seeing a lot of challenges around resources for many smaller economies that have been reliant on the global economy. We're seeing an energy crisis, we're seeing a climate crisis, we're seeing fuel crisis, we're seeing trade crises, left, right, and center. We're seeing various economies crumbling and in various stages of crumble. And it's just more destabilization after what was a global pandemic. We don't necessarily see a reasonable recovery in many of these economies. And, you know, we can't even just say that it's the smaller economies, because even something like the US economy having, well, the US government having a budgetary challenge in terms of approving budgets and trying to make sacrifices in certain budgets over other budgets, just tells you that there is a greater challenge around what is the global economy. You're also seeing a lot more countries trying to depend on the West. You're seeing BRICS starting to talk about de-dollarization. All of these things, if you put them together, create a melting pot. And we mustn't lose sight of it. And while I am cognizant that all of these things are happening, I'm also saying that we mustn't fall into the trap of woe is me, but we can't ignore what the reality of life is showing us at the moment. And it's showing us that there's a requirement for a lot of overhauling. There's a requirement for a lot of work to be done towards stabilization. And we mustn't lose sight of that, because the fact is, as people, you can only take so much. The fact is, the more the pressure is applied, the more it starts to actually feel like a smaller and smaller world. The fact is, if you put too much pressure on an egg, at some point it's going to crack. And we mustn't actually lose sight of the fact that there is a potential crack. There's a potential bubble bursting, and all of these things are pointing towards that bursting bubble. What happens in the sense of how we recover from that burst bubble is probably going to be something that we need to actually pay attention to.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like for so long, humanity hasn't seen their direct reaction to their action. And we're just seeing that now in various senses, in the way like the economic reality is shifting. I think your illustration was analogy was yet again perfect, especially because I think it can be used for the planet as well. And so I just want to reflect for the last few minutes on like really like how is the checks and balances of the planet, because like without in that equation we could count on most trees in order to produce enough carbon storage and oxygen emission in order to not keep that balance in check, because we're always like over the count every year, but still do a little bit of job at stabilizing the earth. And we're wondering if that balance is changing right now. And so Nadia, would you like to just like explain? Probably explanation would be enough to just like open the discussion.
Yeah, because of like such drastic climate change, now our trees are coming to the point where they can't absorb as much carbon, CO2, carbon dioxide, as they used to. And now it's come to the point where they're emitting carbon, CO2, instead of like absorbing it. And so we're at a point where it used to be our saving point that we would keep planting more trees to absorb all this emission. And now they're like dying per se. And the article in France that was explaining this, they did some testing on the bark as well as the insides of the tree and seeing that they're rotting from the inside, and the ground is not as nutritious for the trees as it used to be. So it's a problem that they're still trying to figure out what would be the best way to resolve. And it's definitely a spiritual perspective to see that what is going on in our trees, and we're definitely emitting more than what our, like there's definitely more of a give than a take. And you guys can clarify this in more of a spiritual perspective on how you see this issue going on and what you might think is like the healing point of this.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think the healing point is pretty much similar to what we were saying about like countries or their economies, about really taking the responsibility of reaction of all the actions we have caused, and really thinking about that spiritual check and balance. And yeah, we know we're in a crisis. We're discovering in which way, and we're discovering that we cannot rely on one thing as a crutch in order to like change our reality. We must make the choices ourselves. There's no other thing or other person that is going to do it for us. And that's why planting trees is like, in a sense, it's a blessing to know that, in order to know like which is the appropriate spiritual and physical reaction to such a crisis.
I do think it's
Yeah.
important for us to also just remember that everything has a saturation point. So we're saying these trees no longer are carbon sinks. They are now carbon emitters. Well, let's just be honest with ourselves in saying that we haven't actually given them time to process the level of emission in a healthy manner. And what happens with anything when it reaches a saturation point? It goes in the opposite direction. This is science. It's not magic. It's not confusion. It's science. And we need to stop saturating life with things that create poison, and then are surprised when the poison leaks out. Like, actually, that is the very definition of insanity. And this is literally the point at which we need to stop choosing insanity.
Very last word, Sage.
Oh, I just wanted to say too, I think too, maybe for the best reporting for, or most responsible reporting for this, is show it in the full context. So be like, okay, so maybe like trees, at least they've seen this in France, but I don't know around the world, like they aren't absorbing as much carbon anymore. But how does that factor into like the entire global strategy of like reducing carbon in the atmosphere? Because if you have article after article after article, people are scrolling through showing one piece of crisis after another, but they're not putting it in the full perspective of how we're responding to the crisis, that can be bad and not promoting people's peace and well-being. I just want to add that. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty spontaneous.
Yeah, because That's some doom scrolling. That's why the term doom scrolling exists.
Well, I mean, doom scrolling leads to trauma bonding, but let's avoid that. Well, so thank you guys for the conversation today. Thank you to everybody that's followed us. Also, please feel free to like and subscribe to our Church of Union YouTube channel. And we look forward to seeing all of you again next week. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.